It's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamie Trammell. Dr. Trammell is an associate professor of environmental science, policy, and sustainability who's dedicated to thinking about the future in a more proactive and actionable way. He specializes working with communities and experts across disciplines to better understand the trajectory and diversity of plausible futures for a given place and people. He has worked in a variety of sociological systems, including the deserts of the Southwest, the northern rivers of New South Wales, Australia, across Alaska and Canada, and throughout the Intermountain West. Trained as a landscape ecologist and conservation planner, he holds a BA in biology and environmental studies, an MS in geography, and a PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation. And he has a nickname. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scenario.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for the introduction. Thank you so much to JEDC for inviting me. And thank you all for having a strong interest, obviously, in the future of Alaska, but breaking down some of those barriers so that we can actually get to the desired future that we're really interested in. I'm going to see if the clicker works for me. Okay, it does. Awesome. I have the touch. I am from Southern Oregon University, as Brian mentioned, but I'm also at the Alaska Center for Conservation Science. And I highlight that because I was here for 5 years, and even though I left Alaska, Alaska hasn't left me, so I still very much have so much allegiance and so much interest and love for the state. And so I'm really excited to be here and be able to share with you a little bit about scenario thinking and how I think about the future and how I think all of us can think about the future in just a slightly more opportunistic and innovative way. So first off, I am a professor. I have to do this like engagement thing. So I want to hear popcorn style. What's the first word that comes to your mind when you think about the future? Not just Alaska future, the future. What's the first thing? And just go, popcorn.
Technology, flying cars.
Technology, nice. Technology, flying cars, volatility. Worry. Quantum computing, awesome. Conservation. AI. Climate change. Extraterrestrials. Awesome. Good. More questions. Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Excellent. Well, like Brian mentioned, I'm trained as an ecologist and a conservation biologist. And so when I got started early on in my career, when I was starting to think about the future, and we do this in environmental science, right? All I heard was crisis, 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 crisis. Everything's in crisis, right? It doesn't matter what you're talking about. We have a drought coming, or we have wildfires coming, or we're losing species at an alarming rate, or we have poverty and we can't get food to the right people, and so people are going hungry, right? Or right close here, we have melting glaciers, and we don't know how fast or how quickly they're going to go away or which ones are going to go away. And just all this crisis around me. And I thought, well, that's not productive. So I want to get in there and I want to fix this, right? As we all do, as you all do as early, young people. I'm going to go in and fix it. So I'm going to learn how to model things. I'm going to go in and be an environmental scientist, and I'm going to learn how to model things so that we can change this trajectory. So we're not always talking about crisis, because I'm an eternal optimist, right? We can fix this. But then I ran into this great big wall called uncertainty. Oh goodness, do scientists like to talk about uncertainty, right? We talk about it in a lot of different ways. Probably all of you have seen graphs like this, right? Where you're looking at the uncertainty of potential emission scenarios. This is just right out of the IPCC, right? Where we look past and we know where our CO2 levels are, but goodness, going forward, there's a lot of uncertainty. And this is intentional uncertainty, right? We have different assumptions and everything, and that's okay. But we haven't really dealt with it very well in the scientific community. We can come up with better models that get us a little closer, define that uncertainty a little better, but we're still not, it's not the whole thing, right? There's still uncertainty. There will always be uncertainty because the world is infinitely complex and our brains are pretty finite. Even when we all get together, we're still finite. We have to simplify things. And when we do that, we create these models, and it's even more simplified, right? So there's uncertainty around. And so I thought, well, goodness, I don't like the way scientists just say, okay, uncertainty is dealt with through assumptions. Like, that's great. It's a really important step for models, but it doesn't help us fix that crisis thing that I was worried about. And so I realized this just raised all these questions about uncertainty. And I heard this in the media, and I heard this through conversations with people who are scientists and aren't scientists. There's all this speculation about things. Speculation about new climate patterns. We have good models to suggest things, but we don't know which one it's going to be. There's speculation about the loss and trajectory of glaciers, sea level rise, you name it, right? There's all this speculation. And you have to ask yourself, who's right? Who's wrong? Where are we in this trajectory? Are we just at the beginning? Are we at the end of it? Are we midway? Which way is it going to go? And I realized that's not the right way to approach things. And luckily, I found this guy. Yep. I promise it'll come. There we go. This was my PhD advisor, Scott Bassett, and he worked with a guy, Carl Steinitz, at Harvard in the landscape architecture department, if you can imagine where this is going. And I read this book called Alternative Futures for Changing Landscapes, and I thought, whoa, this is interesting. This is fascinating. So this was written in 1993 as an examination of the San Pedro River Basin and all the things that were impacting this region. But what I found particularly interesting was that they had proposed this framework and had the audacity to ask questions of communities like, is our place working well? How should the place work? What are the options for this place working in the future? And through iterations with models and people and all the groups that would be interested in this, right? Like, all of that was iterated to define, well, if we don't like the way it's working, how might we change it? And it's important coming from a landscape architecture firm or department, because what do landscape architects do? They design things. So they're literally designing the future in a couple of different ways to get at that essential question of, like, well, if we don't like how it's working, how could it work in the future? So I went down the path of scenario thinking. I said, well, this is pretty cool. I like this process. Let's see what's written about it. And I go back to this original definition from Herman Kahn and Anthony Weiner in a book in 1967. So I'm sure you've all heard scenarios. I'm sure you've all heard scenario analysis and scenario planning, but probably more in the current context of, like, scenarios for climate and those kinds of things. This has actually been discussed a long time ago. So they're in their pivotal book, The Year 2000, A Framework for Thinking About the Future. They proposed this definition of a scenario, which is important because it talks about, it's this hypothetical sequence, right, of events that allow you to focus on the causal processes of change and decision points. So that was the first definition. And that led, he was writing it more in the context of, like, oh my gosh, are we into the, like, thermonuclear war kind of scenarios? Are we thinking about global domination by the Soviet Union? That's how he was kind of framing this. We've taken that now and expanded it in many, many different areas, and I'm going to talk to a few about those, or about a few of those here in a minute. But this notion of scenario kind of spread out through a couple of different sectors. And it actually brought me back to Carl Steinitz and Scott Bassett, my PhD advisor, and his good colleague, Alan Shearer. So Alan's written a lot on scenarios and scenario thinking, and you're going to see a few things from him in this presentation. But he provided a couple more definitions to help us get past just that initial, like, okay, we're not just talking about, like, war games and thermonuclear war scenarios. We're actually thinking about, like, how do we use this framework as a constructive way to think about the future and then make really, really important decisions now that impact our future. So scenarios are fictional. That's important, but not fanciful. So no scenario that you've ever read should be assigned a probability. That's not a scenario. Scenarios are fictional. They can't be right because all of our thinking about the future is informed by the past, and we know that the future is going to change. Something's going to change. Fictional, but not fanciful. And it describes it over a time period, puts some boundaries on it, right? And then he goes on to define that scenarios describe situations, actions, and consequences that are all interrelated. So this means there's an opportunity to think about not just like one or two drivers, we're talking about like holistic thinking about the future. What are all the things that might come together to define some element or some notion of the future? So, if that's what scenarios are, what in the heck is scenario thinking? Well, I have to go to Peter Schwartz. I don't know, has anybody read Peter Schwartz's The Art of the Long View? Okay, one hand, that's Kai. Has anybody heard of the Royal Dutch Shell scenarios? Okay, maybe a couple of more. I would expect, hopefully in Alaska, you've heard a little bit about this. I'm going to tell you more about it. Peter Schwartz made famous the Royal Dutch Shell scenarios. He says scenario thinking is this. It's a method for bringing future considerations into present decisions when predictions simply aren't possible. And we know a lot of the things that we're concerned about of the future are not predictable. So it provides this opportunity to bring future considerations into the now. How empowering is that? I mean, many decisions that we face are things that we're facing right now. We're not thinking about what are the consequences, what are the long-term consequences, or even thinking about some desired state and then moving towards that with our decisions now. I also like Steve Carpenter. Steve Carpenter is an ecologist, and he was actually one of the lead authors for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that has led to all of our kind of biodiversity crisis goals. And he is a big believer in scenario thinking, and he says scenarios broaden these perspectives, raise questions, expose possibilities for surprise, and raise these challenges to conventional thinking. So we're getting into that innovation space, right, with scenarios. And I really do like to say scenarios just means you're asking better questions. Instead of asking what will happen, we have to ask what change might occur. What could these look like in our organization, in our community, in our place, in our environment? What alternatives do we have? Our mental models, or our physical models, our computational models? What alternatives do we have to these models? What could those tell us about our assumptions? What could that tell us about what we think might actually unfold? And most importantly, what actions might we suggest to improve these possible outcomes? This provides an opportunity for dialogue, which is another key tenet of good scenario thinking, is having this constant dialogue with all the people who think differently, some the same, but hopefully differently, about what those future conditions might be and what those drivers would be. Because instead of asking what will happen, you get to ask what could, or what might happen, and use that as your opportunity to then move forward together. So, one example of this is from Royal Dutch Shell Oil. And they, in the early 1960s, compiled a team called, I have it here, the Long-Term Studies Group. And this Long-Term Studies Group, in 1971 and 1972, constructed what you see up here on this slide, which is a graphical representation of scenarios that described what could happen to oil prices. This was in 1971, 1972. And because it was embedded within the corporate structure, they were able to bring these to the managers, and the managers said, well, what are your assumptions behind these things? And they said, well, what happens if the production moves, the quota on production, oil production, moves more towards the oil-producing countries instead of this general market force, which was driving it traditionally? And their manager said, oh, well, that's interesting. I guess we'd do this. And then it went and sat on the shelf until 1973, when all of a sudden OPEC said, we're going to determine what the oil prices are. And Royal Dutch Shell was the one group that had anticipated, at least at that managerial level, they'd thought about it. Doesn't mean they'd made major changes to their organization at all. but it means that they'd thought about it and they were more prepared then for that reality to come out. So if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend this book, The Art of the Long View. He describes that whole process of how Peter Schwartz ended up running that scenario team for Royal Dutch Shell after this event. It's a really interesting read, especially for this community. So let me tell you about how scenarios are built, because there's a little bit of magic under the hood. And I want all of you, I'm a teacher, right? I want you to be able to do these things. I want you to be able to go and implement this idea of scenario thinking in your world. So first, though, quick description. There's at least 3 different types. I don't know, you can ask people. There's sometimes 8 different types of scenarios. But I want to point out there's 3 fundamentally different types of scenarios out there. And you'll see some of these diversity of scenarios in this region even playing out. So there's normative, which are a scenario exercise where you identify a preferred future and you move towards that. You still identify multiple scenarios. Then you decide that's the one that we want to go for, and you run towards it. You come up with all kinds of ways to get there. We have descriptive and exploratory, which is more focused on those drivers, those things that are variable, that we can't really predict, but we know are going to shape things really strongly. And it's exploratory. It's really in that, like, we don't know exactly what's happening, but we want to holistically cover all of our bases. We want to understand the full suite of options. And then there's transformative and visionary, which is really geared towards, okay, we know the future that we're going on right now isn't the one that we want in the future. We want to design scenarios to get us to a preferred state, which is different than normative. And so I'm going to mostly talk about these descriptive exploratory, but I should note that Rios and through the Spruce Root Group is doing this transformative scenario process throughout Southeast. And so you will see this opportunity to engage and understand and learn from these different approaches to scenarios. Okay, second thing before I tell you how scenarios are built is actually the fact that you need a framing question. You need some sort of way to put some brackets around the future, because we all like to think of the future in these really big terms and sometimes these really big hurdles that we're facing. But the more that you can define the question or the framing goal initially, the stronger and the more effective your scenarios are going to be. So some examples, and it is key. We just wrapped up an Arctic urban rule or risks and adaptation project. There's a lot of us, I'll be talking more about that in a second, that did this, but basically looking at climate risks and the impact it has on urban areas in the Arctic using 3 different communities. And there, the framing question was a little too broad. It was called this adaptive policy framework. But it had these specified risks that we had to look at. And that provided a little bit of focal area, right? You can say, oh, well, we know these 3 kind of risks are going to be presenting themselves to communities throughout the Arctic. Let's coalesce around that. That became the framing questions. Work that I did in the Kenai River watershed about almost a decade ago. I can't believe it's been this long. We had a different one. We had a different framing. We said, hey, what happens to the Kenai if you have a change in salmon abundance or diversity or timing, any of those kinds of questions? What happens when you have a change in salmon? That was the foundation of our scenarios. And from that, then, you can start building out this typical workflow. We identified issues. So issues are typically things that we're presented with now, that we're all thinking about. I heard a lot of them from our introductory remarks, right? Education and population, those kinds of things. These are the issues we're facing now that we know are important. That moves into decisions. So what decisions are we making about those issues right now? What decisions do we think we're going to be making about those issues in the near future? And then it goes into this weird thing called uncertainties. So it's not uncertainty, it's uncertainties. It's multiple uncertainties. So no longer am I in the realm of just being able to do simulation models and reduce the uncertainty by, doing Monte Carlo simulations. No, now we're looking at multiple sources of uncertainty. And it feeds directly off of decisions. Because once we identify the decisions that we're thinking about right now, that we're making around these issues that are defining our place, then we can kind of point at those things that we know are important, but we're not really making decisions around them now, or they're too hard to predict, or we can't agree on the nature of the trajectory. So those uncertainties are really like the essence of what we don't know about the future. And that's a really important step to get to. So let me fill this in with some examples. This is from our Salmon 2050 work in the Kenai almost a decade ago. And there was the top two issues, again, framing question about salmon, obviously was warming temperatures. So those warming temperatures in the creeks and the rivers and what that was doing to the salmon, and then habitat loss. I don't know if anybody's from the Kenai, but the whole 50-foot setback from riparian area was very much at the forefront of the conversation, so it was all about like, this is an issue we're dealing with. We can't protect the salmon habitat fast enough. So that means the decisions were things like, should we prioritize habitat conservation over development? Or should we create a watershed plan to like understand the differential nature of warming on creeks? These were the decisions that they were kind of on the precipice of. They were just starting to like, should we do this or shouldn't we? Which leads into then the uncertainties that came from this, which was, will development continue to encroach on fish habitat? Because you can imagine that going a couple of different ways, and some people agree that it's more important than others, and other people might not agree that that's as important. That makes it a good critical uncertainty. Does anybody have a crystal ball that can tell how much development's going to occur in the Kenai? No, right? So it's a good uncertainty. Or will climate warming result in increased stream temperatures across the watershed? Again, so many climate models, so many climate scenarios. There's a lot of uncertainty there to unpack. And the key is that you define these, and then you look at the full range of uncertainty associated with this. So these critical uncertainties basically become this funnel, this combination of things that we know from experts, and this is experts from local indigenous expert knowledge to just industry knowledge to planning knowledge, all the people that hold that expert knowledge, right? To models that we have, demographic or economic, population, those kinds of things, and then research. And all of this informs what we call critical uncertainties. So through iteration, through community consensus, we build this idea of like, okay, here's all the things that we just don't know about, but here's the top like 5. Here are the things that we are just confident across all sectors, across all ways of thinking. These 5 things are really going to fundamentally impact us. What does the science say? What does the research say? What do our models say about this? That defines some space. And it's a great integrator. Again, from the Kenai, it allowed us to integrate Kenichi traditional knowledge. It integrated social network theories about how decisions were being made and who was making those decisions and how much pull they had in the system. It allowed us to bring in all of our physical observations of hydrology and landscape change. All of this came into like defining those critical uncertainties and the range of uncertainty around that critical uncertainty. Like, here's what the science says. Here's what we've observed with our instruments. This is the range. And instead of limiting that through assumptions, we want that whole big picture. We want the whole thing in here to help us define scenarios. And this is because, and this is the most complicated graphic, I promise, that I'll show you. This is from, because I put this in front of students and they're like, whoa, mind blown, can't go there. But I trust you all can. So this is again from Alan Shearer, a good colleague of mine. He came up with this nice diagram illustrating how these uncertainties have shaped our past decisions. And so if you look at the distant past and you look at those axes and you think about, yeah, we kind of had this like environmental condition and we had this population driver and we had some economic development, that all like created this space for decision making. And I don't think I can point at it with my laser pointer, but that's that black spot in the middle of the axes there. So that was the distant past, and we're really good. Like, we know where we were in the past and what decisions we made. We can do that really well. And that defined our next step, what we've recently made decisions about. We know that space. We know what we've done, and we know the outcomes of that. What's important is that the decisions we made in the distant past limited where we could go in the near past. And those decisions that we just recently made have limited where we are now. And it's really important to think of that, because as we think in the future, we have to define what those decisions might be, and how much that might limit our future decision-making space. So think of these axes as the uncertainties. And each line in that axis, right, each value in the axis is just a different variety of that uncertainty. It's not always linear, but it's a different type of that of uncertainty. It's a different treatment of that uncertainty. And so if you think about moving that forward, how do we design scenarios up there in that near term, that future A, B, C, and D? How do we design scenarios to sufficiently gather enough of that uncertainty that we have some confidence that we've treated it well, that we've acknowledged, yes, this is uncertain, but here's 5 different versions of that uncertainty playing out. And how do we want to respond in that situation? What does that do for our decision space? Because if you look at scenario C and you say, oh, you've gone down scenario C in 10 years, all of a sudden your decision space is limited. Notice that that green area, which is your decision space, is smaller than the blue area. The blue area defines your decision space kind of at that near term. But if you've decided scenario C is where we're going, your decision space becomes smaller. That's not always bad, but that's something that as a community, you should understand. That if you go along this scenario, or any of these scenarios, you've limited your decision space. As an ecologist, I think about this a lot. You can't undo lost habitat. It's very, very hard to do that, right? That's a fixed decision that has implications long into the future. So, this is his kind of diagram of how we start to build this. Let me show you another example, though. And, oh yes, there's the climate and habitat kind of axes. And you can just imagine how these things might play out, right? You might treat one climate scenario in one scenario, say one of the RCP 6.0, which is like the moderate change. And you might combine that with a low habitat loss scenario or a high habitat loss scenario. And depending on how you combine those things, and they have to be logically combined, you can't just put it in a blender and hope it all works out. Logically combined uncertainties. But you can imagine the response of a given community might be different, and in the Kenai, it absolutely was. If we assume a certain level of climate change, but not loss in habitat, that's a different response. That's a different call to the community than high levels of climate and high levels of habitat loss. Oop. Said again. So Brian mentioned that we've been doing a little bit of survey work, and some of you have hopefully fed into this survey. It's still a live survey. We encourage you to feed into this. But to give you an example of this process a little more directly, this is information that we've gleaned so far from the surveys on issues, decisions, uncertainties, and even a teaser on a scenario narrative around Juneau. So the top issue, hands down, so far has been lack of affordable housing. That was ranked, that was identified and re-ranked by folks taking the survey. And this is just so far, it's very drafty, but so far. That issue led into you all, who took the survey, defining a decision around, well, should Juneau manage land development and zoning differently? Is that something that we should be doing? Hearing for the deputy mayor, yes. That is an opportunity, right? That's a decision we can make now. And in the future, right? It's something that can lead us. So the uncertainty would be then, well, will the city and borough of Juneau support increased housing development and expansion? And you could imagine a couple of different ways of treating that question. We could say yes or no, but it's the maybes that I'm kind of interested in too. Yes and no provide the bounds. That provides that outside boundary of that blue decision space, right? So that's the edge of plausible before you get fanciful, yes or no. But the maybes, the sort ofs, the, well, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, that's where it gets really interesting. It's not just a yes or no response. You can start to tease this out. And so in a scenario narrative, we might say no, boundaries and zoning are fixed. There is no change at that level. That may or may not affect the affordable housing kind of issue, right? Or you could say yes, annexing galore, rezoning galore, all kinds of incentives, right? That's the other side of it. Or you could say partially, we're going to encourage infill only, or we're going to encourage certain types of zoning redevelopment. I know in my hometown, we just got rid of single family zoning, period. Actually, in the entire state of Oregon, just passed a law saying that there is no more single-family housing. That's a big change. Big change, at least in urban environments. So you can see now, maybe, hopefully, you take this issue and decision pathway to define those critical uncertainties, and now you get to start to play with them. It's like a sandbox of innovation, right? You get to say, well, what happens if we do this? What happens if we do that? Let's get creative. Let's think about the maybes and the sort ofs. That's how you build a good scenario narrative. So a word on narratives, because as your senator said, scenarios are stories. And that's really empowering. It opens up our opportunities to communicate this to a much broader audience than a bunch of dated heads like I traditionally get called, right? Or, we have this opportunity to integrate different knowledge streams when we tell stories and we use art to do this. It opens up the platform. And so the value of narratives are these. It integrates all uncertainties. So when I say all uncertainties, critical uncertainties, we typically want to get down to those 4 or 5 things that we all agree are really, really, really important, and then treat all of them. You can't just say, oh no, climate change is too big, we're going to ignore that one and deal with these others. You don't get that pass. You have to think through all of the logical pathways. If this happens, and this happens, and this happens, what happens? What's the outcome of this scenario? And then you tell a story about how it's going to unfold. You actually start with the end point. You say, in 2040, Juneau is going to have this, 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 and this. And you have to tell the story about how we got there. How, as a community, you rallied around this, or you let external factors drive how you got to that end point per scenario. You identified these key thresholds in the uncertainties through this narrative process. So you say, well, you know what, population just kept moving and moving and moving until it hit this point, because that's when city and borough said, nope, no more. We're full, we're done. You can set those thresholds to describe that future. And they're internally consistent. So it's this nice summarized package of like how the future is unfolding, told from that future perspective, almost like if you were writing a newspaper article in the year 2040 about how things changed. You're kind of describing all of that. That's the heart of a scenario narrative. But it gives these thresholds and allows us to treat all those uncertainties in ways that help us just make the future a bit more real. Because oftentimes we're overwhelmed by these uncertainties. We're like, I just can't get past it. And what we found in the Kenai was that it was climate change. Climate change was like the big old 800-pound gorilla in the room that just wouldn't let anybody be creative. Because they're like, oh, we just can't, there's so much uncertainty around climate change. We just have to address climate change. And once we got past that, all these other issues came up with like, wow, but there's this land use stuff, and oh my gosh, there's the personal use fishery, and there's sport fishermen, user days are increasing like crazy. Once you got past that big uncertainty that just seems to drive the narrative for so many people, you actually get to that creative point. We're like, oh, well, what else is happening, and how do we explore that? How do we explore our role in driving that and controlling that and coming up with a more desirable future? I will say, though, scenarios are not perfect. They're fictional, right? They can't describe everything. So I liken it to this. It's stuff that could happen. It's not going to collect ever or connect every single detail. It's not going to have every single threshold or every single bit of information. But it should give you enough information that you generally know what you're looking at. So like a flashlight in a room, it'd be a lot easier if we could just turn on the lights and see everything and see the position of tables and everything, right? But scenarios at least give you a flashlight so you can see some element of that future that then helps you understand, okay, are we going to run into a table or a wall, or are we good? Can we navigate through this room? Can we use this flashlight to help us to shine a little bit of light on that uncertain future? So let's talk about the use of scenarios. And just quick show of hands, since we did have our deputy mayor mention that she's been part of a scenario thinking exercise. Who's been part of scenario thinking or a scenario planning exercise before? Quick show of hands. Awesome. That's great. So you all have real examples that you could also use, right? Let me give you a couple of quick ones. So I got my start working actually in Camp Pendleton for the Department of Defense doing this work. Military is very big on scenario use. We know this, especially with war games. But this was the exploratory scenarios. And what they came to us with is they said, well, we have this Camp Pendleton, and I don't know if anybody's been to Camp Pendleton, but you all know Southern California is a big old megalopolis of people, right? You have LA and San Diego taking up most of the coastal area. And you have Camp Pendleton that was established there before LA and San Diego were really big cities. And because of that, they're the largest remaining intact habitat of coastal chaparral, a military base where hundreds of thousands of people, troops, move through that military base. They have to manage 26 different endangered species because urban growth has happened around them. They said, we have to get ahead of this. We can't just allow this to continue to happen. So they contracted with us to do some scenario analysis. And the big thing that came out of that was actually this partnership between the Department of Defense and the Trust for Public Lands. Because you can kind of see, hopefully, on this map, there's some national forests right outside of Camp Pendleton that allowed some movement of animals, but not enough. And it didn't stop urban encroachment onto the base for most of the base. And so by partnering with the Trust for Public Lands, they actually, all those light green areas were areas that were acquired for conservation in a partnership with the Department of Defense, where this nonprofit, this local arm of the nonprofit, took ownership of these scenarios and said, hey, we're not a big bureaucracy. We can kind of just go in and buy this land, and it serves the purpose of conservation and keeping species off of your military base so that you can maintain your operations. That's one of the creative solutions that's come out of scenario planning, these new protected areas. In the Kenai, we explored all kinds of things, like I said, economic, climate, personal use participation, population. You can kind of get a sense there of my graphs. I'm not going to be too quantitative here, but we varied the uncertainty. That's what we're doing. Those dashed lines, that's your way of varying uncertainty. So one scenario might treat these uncertainties these ways. And as an outcome, I've got some cool quotes from various participants saying that it gave a better process or a better understanding of these broad impacts, that the data, the information that we collected was really useful. But my very favorite was from one of the planners up there, and he said, this has changed the way that I think about planning. It's a paradigm shift, because never before had they given the permission to really think integratively about all these different factors. One from Idaho. This is something I just wrapped up real recently, where we were looking at the changes in food, energy, and water availability in rural Idaho. So this part of Idaho actually is the third largest producer of dairy, and they're looking at climate change, and they're looking at all these pressures and thinking, well, goodness, is this going to be something that we can sustain in the future? And from our scenario process came a new regional water coordination, because they realized decisions upstream were really impacting and limiting their decision space. A brand new rural economic development strategy that looked at, oh gosh, all the things that have driven the economy here for the last 40 years aren't going to be the things in the future. So the rural economic strategy is completely different and based on scenarios now. And most exciting, I think, to me, was we started this project in 2018. We had developed critical uncertainties. We'd started to develop scenarios, and then COVID-19 hit. And we said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We can't connect with the people. We can't talk about these issues. But we realized really quickly that we had actually uncovered one of the responses to COVID-19 and the scenario planning process. The scenario thinking had allowed them to develop an uncertainty around market prices of various commodities, so sugar beets and grains and things that were important to the region, as well as dairy. And we said, what happens if you have a fluctuation of that? And they thought it was going to be drivers from tariffs. They thought tariffs were going to be the big impact on global supply chain. Well, it wasn't tariffs. It was COVID-19, disrupted the supply chain. And this is the scenario that they devised. They talked about a locavore scenario. Instead of going into the global market, we're going to retool and we're going to refocus our effort on local food chain supplies instead of the global. Again, hadn't acted, but it started there. And when the pandemic hit, they were much more prepared for this. Finally, just some of the recommendations from this article, Urban Risks and Adaptations. It's a really cool report. If you're interested, talk to me or Kai. There's a whole bunch of us here from AKV3 that did this work. But we had scenarios for Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Whitehorse describing what would happen, what could happen if we vary these levels of rain and winter, permafrost loss, and wildfire incidents. And some of the recommendations, some of the outcomes of this, and this is coming from the people in the workshops, the community workshops, data sharing strategies, interdisciplinary plan and review, right? Things like the borough hosting scenario planning and public outreach around this, and unified road maintenance, all of these things, all these creative solutions to the future that they don't have to do right now, but if they do, creates this opportunity for actually designing the scenario, the future that they want. So it all comes down to just a better way to think about the future. Thinking holistically, thinking creatively, and I hope by now you agree with me, the scenario thinking is at the heart of innovation. It's one of those things that allows us to think beyond the trends, think beyond what we see today and what we expect today. Think about the issues and opportunities that don't yet exist, but very much could. And enabling all of us to navigate the uncertainty, anticipate future trends, developing innovative strategies that position us for the long term. So I think scenario thinking is integral to this notion of innovation, and a real opportunity here with you all and over the next day doing these deep dives to really own this process, own this thinking. So with that, I'll end, and I would love to entertain questions if I have time. Okay, I'm getting the signals that we have maybe time for one or two questions. Anybody? Okay. I've either answered all of them. Okay, awesome. One.
When I was looking at the different stages and you used the term uncertainty, it occurred to me that uncertainty could also be replaced with the term constraint, but I don't know what your thoughts or how you define uncertainty versus constraint.
Yeah, good question, for sure. So I would say constraints, obviously that's a bit more limiting, that's a boundary, right? Uncertainties are really those things that, like, really truly we can't predict. And constraints, we often understand the limits of things, right? We generally understand the limits of things. And so a constraint can be a bit more defined, although there's some uncertainty in the limits of various things. So I could see where some constraints become uncertain. But generally, when we're talking about uncertainty, we're really it's those things that we can't even put like a neat boundary around. They're just so big, or they're so complicated, or they're so value-laden that there's no box we can put it in. And that's really where you want to kind of tease it out in a scenario to say, okay, if we don't even know the bounds of our understanding, where can we at least start to have a conversation around what this might look like? Excellent. Any others? Oh, one more.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the types of expertise or the range of expertise you need to incorporate with scenario planning? Because it seems like you're talking about a lot of areas that would incorporate things like economics and demographics and ecology and all these really complicated different disciplines. Can you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, it can get as big and complicated as you want, or it can be really refined. It does, though, depend on how you're engaging the communities. And so oftentimes when I'm building a research team that's going to come in and do scenarios, I do look at the expertise that we have. And whatever holes we have, we try to fill with community. We try to fill those knowledge and expertise holes with people from the community. That's really the only way you can do it, because it is so integrative. It's so much information streams, information types coming in. You do need that broader look, for sure. Great. All right. Well, thank you again so much. Look forward to seeing all of you in the breakouts tomorrow. Thanks.